The moment Eudora Maddox stepped off the stagecoach into the blistering afternoon sun of Harlan County, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she knew with absolute certainty that she was about to walk straight into the wrong life, and she had absolutely no idea how magnificently right that wrong turn would turn out to be. The dust settled around her boots like a reluctant farewell from the trail behind her. She pressed one gloved hand against the brim of her hat to shield her eyes from the brutal Texas sun, and looked out at the land that stretched before her in every direction, wide and golden, and indifferent to the small drama playing out on the edge of it. She was 24 years old, freshly arrived from St. Louis, Missouri, carrying 2 leather trunks, 1 carpet bag, a carefully folded letter of introduction, and the weight of a decision she had made 3 weeks ago in a moment of desperation and unexpected courage. The letter in her carpet bag was addressed to a Mr. Hollis Dunn of the Dunn family ranch, and it confirmed her arrangement as a housekeeper and cook to his household. She had answered the advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch with a steady hand and a racing heart, written her qualifications with the confidence of a woman who had spent 6 years managing her ailing father's boarding house, and received an acceptance letter that felt like a door swinging open in a room that had run out of air. She had the address written on a small piece of paper in her own careful handwriting. Dunn Family Ranch. 2 miles east of Harlan Station. Follow the fence line north past the creek crossing. 3rd gate on the left. What she did not know was that there were 2 creek crossings on the east side of Harlan Station. What she did not know was that her directions had been copied down with one critical error. What she did not know was that the 3rd gate on the left past the 1st creek crossing led not to the Dunn family ranch, but to a property that had belonged to the Archer family for the past 11 years, a place called Redstone. The man at the livery who rented her a horse and simple cart for her trunks was old and hard of hearing, and nodded helpfully when she asked about the route, assuming she meant the 1st crossing because that was the one most people meant. She thanked him, loaded her trunks, tied her carpet bag to the seat beside her, and set off down the eastern road with the confidence of a woman who had memorized her directions, and the vulnerability of a woman who had no idea the land was about to correct her. The ride was long and warm, and the countryside opened itself to her in waves of buffalo grass and cedar, and the occasional flash of a mockingbird cutting low across the road. She passed the 1st creek crossing without recognizing it as a landmark for her directions, because the man at the livery had told her the creek would be obvious, and both crossings were perfectly obvious in their own right. She followed the fence line north, found the 3rd gate on the left, unlatched it carefully, and drove her little cart up the winding track toward a ranch house she had never seen before. The house came into view around a bend of old live oak trees, and she felt her breath ease slightly at the sight of it. It was solid and well kept, a long single-story structure built of stone and cedar with a covered porch running the full length of the front. There were flowers planted along the porch rail, which surprised her. Wild roses, and something with small yellow blooms that she could not identify at this distance. There was a stone water trough near the front of the yard, a large barn visible to the left with its doors standing open, and beyond the barn the slope of a hill covered in green pasture where a dozen or so horses moved lazily in the afternoon light. She set the brake on the cart, gathered her carpet bag, and climbed down from the seat. She smoothed her skirt, straightened her hat, and walked up the 3 porch steps to the front door. She knocked twice, firmly, the way her father had always said a person ought to knock when they meant to be taken seriously. The door opened, and she got her first look at Graham Archer. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that had been pushed back by a hand that had clearly been busy with something before she knocked. His eyes were a startling shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately place, something between surprise and careful attention. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his forearms were bronzed from the sun. He was not what she would have called classically handsome in the manner of illustrated magazine portraits, but he had a face that made you want to keep looking at it, all strong planes and an honesty that seemed structural rather than practiced. He said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at her, which she found either rude or remarkably direct depending on how charitable she was prepared to be at that moment. "Good afternoon," she said, because one of them had to begin. "I am Eudora Maddox. I have been hired as housekeeper and cook. Mr. Dunn is expecting me." Something moved across his face then, too quick to be read properly. He glanced past her at the cart and the trunks and then back to her face, and she had the peculiar sensation that he was making some kind of private calculation. "There is no Mr. Dunn here," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who did not speak unless he had something to say. "This is the Archer property. My name is Graham Archer." Eudora Maddox stared at him for a full 3 seconds, during which the entire afternoon seemed to hold its breath. "Pardon me," she said. "Redstone Ranch," he said, and watched her face change as the information settled over her like cold water. "You have the wrong house, Miss Maddox." She turned around slowly and looked back down the track she had come up, as though the landscape might confess to some kind of mischief. Her horse stood patiently in the traces. Her trunk sat in the cart. The late afternoon sun was beginning to angle lower, turning everything a deep and unhelpful gold. "The third gate past the creek," she said, mostly to herself. "There are 2 creek crossings on this road," he said, not unkindly. "The Dunn property is past the second one." She turned back to face him, and he could see in her expression a woman conducting a rapid internal reckoning, calculating the distance remaining, the hour of the afternoon, the position of the sun, the options available to her. He had the impression she was not a woman who panicked easily, but he could see the edges of her composure doing their best work. "How far is the Dunn Ranch from here?" she asked. "Another 4 miles, give or take," he said, "and the road between here and there runs through the low country. After dark, it is not a road I would recommend to someone unfamiliar with it." She looked at the sun again. It had moved with the indifference of the universe to personal inconvenience. "Is there a town closer?" she asked. "Harlan Station is 6 miles back the way you came," he said. She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it. She had, he noticed, very good posture for a woman who had just been informed that she had arrived at entirely the wrong place after what was clearly a very long journey. There was a quality about her that he found himself observing with more interest than the situation perhaps required. Something composed and precise, and yet not cold. The way a well-made instrument holds its shape even under pressure. "Then I appear to have imposed myself on your property," she said, and her voice was steady, though he thought he caught something underneath it. "I apologize for the intrusion. If I might trouble you for a glass of water for myself and a bucket for my horse, I will get back on the road and see how far I can manage before the light goes." "You cannot manage 4 miles of unfamiliar road before dark," he said plainly. "Not safely. Not with a cart and a horse you rented from old Clement at the livery, who I know for a fact is not selective about the condition of the animals he sends out." She looked at her horse, who chose that precise moment to lower his head and rest one hind foot in a way that could only be described as exhausted. Graham Archer sighed. It was a sigh that seemed to involve his whole frame, the sigh of a man whose practical instincts were overriding something else, some preference for simplicity perhaps, or solitude, she could not tell which. "I have a spare room," he said. "It is a working ranch house, not a hotel, and I will apologize for that in advance. But you are welcome to stay the night and go on to the Dunn property in the morning." Eudora looked at him steadily. "I do not know you, Mr. Archer." "No," he agreed, "you do not. But you know my name, you know where you are, and if it makes you feel any better about it, my cook Maria has been here for 9 years and she will be perfectly scandalized if you sleep in a stranger's barn instead of the spare room, which she will consider a personal insult to her hospitality." Eudora was quiet for a moment. "You have a cook already," she said. "Yes." "Then the Dunn Ranch is the one that needs me." "Yes, Miss Maddox, as I said." She nodded once, a small decisive nod that seemed to settle something for her. "Then I accept your offer of the spare room for this evening, Mr. Archer, and I am grateful for it." He stepped back from the door to let her in, and Eudora Maddox crossed the threshold of the Wrong Ranch house and entered the story of her life. The interior of the house was not what she had expected, though she would have had difficulty explaining exactly what she had expected. It was clean and spare and functional in the way that a house managed by someone practically minded tends to be, but there were small things that surprised her. A shelf of books along one wall of the main room, more books than she had seen in any ranch house in any description she had read. A stone fireplace with a wide mantel that held a collection of objects, a broken compass, a small wooden horse, a smooth river stone of unusual color. Two windows open to the afternoon breeze with curtains of undyed muslin that moved gently, a braided rug on the floor that was old but well kept. She set her carpet bag down near the door and looked at the room with the attentive eye she had developed over years of managing a boarding house. The corners were clean. The table was solid and level. Someone had oiled the hinges on the interior doors recently because none of them had that telltale resistance that came from neglect. The house was cared for. Graham Archer was watching her look at his house, and she sensed it, and she was not embarrassed by it because she was simply doing what any sensible woman newly arrived somewhere does, which is understand the place. "I will see to your horse," he said. "The room is down that hallway, last door on the left. There is a washstand with a full pitcher." "Thank you," she said. He went out. She stood in the main room of the house for a moment longer, listening to the sounds of it, the wind through the muslin curtains, a pot simmering somewhere at the back of the house, the distant creak of the barn door as Graham Archer opened it to take in her horse. Then Maria appeared from the back of the house, a compact Mexican woman of about 50 with black hair streaked heavily with silver, and an expression of determined hospitality that brooked no argument. She took one look at Eudora and began speaking in a mixture of Spanish and English that communicated, in no uncertain terms, that there would be supper, there would be hot water for washing, and there would be no discussion of whether this was a proper arrangement or not because the sun was going down, and a woman did not travel 4 miles of rough Texas road in the dark when there was a perfectly good room available. Eudora, who had managed boarding house guests ranging from difficult to impossible for 6 years, understood authority when it was presented clearly. She thanked Maria in the sincerest terms she had and went to find the spare room. It was small and simply furnished. A narrow bed with a quilt of yellow and cream, a washstand with a blue pitcher and basin, a window that looked out over the pasture where the horses moved in the last of the afternoon light. She set her carpet bag on the chair in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, just breathing. She was at the Wrong Ranch. She had traveled 900 miles from St. Louis, managed a stagecoach journey that had taken 3 days, and involved weather that she would not soon forget, and she had arrived at entirely the wrong place. She had a position waiting for her 4 miles away at the Dunn property, a position she had arranged carefully, and that represented her entire plan for this new chapter of her life. She should have been troubled by today. She should have been more unsettled than she was. Instead, she found herself thinking about a pair of sage-green eyes and a shelf full of books. She unpacked only what she needed for the evening, washed her face and hands with the cold water in the blue pitcher, repinned her dark hair, and went to see if there was anything useful she could do to help with supper. She found Maria at the stove and offered her assistance, which Maria accepted after a single sharp look that seemed to assess her competence. Together, they got on well, working around each other with the practiced ease of 2 people who understand kitchens and the logic of them. Eudora cut the cornbread and set the table and carried the pot of beans to the center without being asked to, and Maria watched her do it and said nothing, but the set of her shoulders relaxed slightly. Graham Archer came in from the barn as the sun finished setting, washed his hands and face at the pump outside, and came to the table with the straightforward appetite of a man who had been working since before dawn. There were 3 of them at the table, Graham and Eudora and Maria, and the meal was simple and good, beef and beans and cornbread and a pot of strong coffee. "Did you telegraph ahead to the Dunn Ranch?" Graham asked her at some point during the meal. He asked it practically as though it were a logistics question that needed answering. "I did not," she said. "Mr. Dunn's letter said to send word if my arrangements changed, and since I expected to arrive today as planned, I saw no need." "He will not know where you are tonight," Graham said. "No," she agreed. "He will think I have been delayed on the road. He may send someone to look for you." She had not thought of this. She looked at Graham with something that was part concern and part reassessment. "Should I send a telegraph from here?" "The nearest telegraph office is back in Harlan Station," he said. "But I am riding into town in the morning to pick up supplies. I can send a message for you before we leave." She was quiet for a moment. "You said we," she pointed out. "I said I would take you to the Dunn property in the morning," he said. "The road through the low country is easier in a group, and I need to take the wagon to town for supplies anyway. The Dunn Ranch is on my way back." It was practical and efficient and offered without any performance of generosity, and somehow that made it easier to accept. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it." Maria said something in Spanish that neither of them responded to directly, but Eudora caught enough of it to understand that it was warm and slightly mischievous, and she kept her eyes on her cornbread and said nothing. After supper, Graham excused himself to do the last rounds of the evening, checking the horses and latching the barn. Maria shooed Eudora away from the washing up with a firmness that was clearly non-negotiable, and Eudora found herself standing on the front porch in the dark Texas night with nothing to do but look at the sky. The sky was extraordinary. She had known intellectually that the stars would be different out here, away from the gas lamps and smoke of St. Louis, but knowing it intellectually and standing under it were 2 different experiences entirely. The Milky Way arched overhead in a dense river of light, and she stood very still with her neck tilted back, and felt something inside her chest open in a way she had not expected. "It does that," said a voice beside her, and she turned to find Graham Archer standing at the far end of the porch, having apparently returned from the barn without her hearing him. "Does what?" she asked. "Surprises people who are not used to seeing it," he said. He came to lean against the porch rail, not near her but not distant either, a comfortable middle distance that did not feel like absence or intrusion. He looked up at the sky too, with the easy familiarity of a man who had been looking at it from this porch for 11 years. "Were you born in Texas?" she asked. "No," he said. "Virginia. I came west after the war." She understood what he meant by the war. The war between the states had ended 17 years ago, but it still shaped the lives of everyone who had lived through it, reshaped them sometimes beyond recognition. She did not ask him which side. She had known men from both sides and found it rarely told you as much about a person as people assumed it did. "I was 12 when it ended," she said. "We were in Ohio. My father ran a dry goods store that became something of a gathering place for anyone coming through on their way west. I grew up listening to travelers." "Is that why you came west yourself?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Partly," she said. "My father died 2 years ago. I managed his boarding house after the store closed, but the building was sold to pay the debts. I had skills and no particular place they were needed, and a friend showed me an advertisement for a housekeeper's position in Texas, and it seemed like the practical answer." "That is a long way to come for the practical answer," he said. "Most practical answers are close enough to reach without much effort," she said. "The good ones tend to require traveling." She felt rather than saw him look at her, a quick sideways assessment that she did not meet directly. The night was warm with the particular warmth of a Texas spring, carrying the smell of grass and cedar and the distant hint of rain somewhere to the north. "You should get some sleep," he said after a little while. "The ride to town is early." "Yes," she agreed. She did not move immediately, neither did he. "Miss Maddox," he said. "Yes." "You are welcome here for as long as you need," he said. He said it simply, without ornament, as though it were just a fact being stated for accuracy's sake, and something about the simplicity of it landed on her with considerable weight. "Thank you, Mr. Archer," she said. She went inside. She lay awake in the narrow bed under the cream and yellow quilt for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into the night, the horses in the pasture, the wind in the live oak trees, something like an owl somewhere far off. She thought about the Dunn Ranch 4 miles away, where Mr. Holly's Dunn was presumably wondering where his new housekeeper had gotten to. She thought about the position she had arranged so carefully, the clean start, the new chapter. And she thought, against her better intentions, about a man with sage-green eyes who had books on his shelf and flowers on his porch rail, and a voice that sounded like it had been built for honesty rather than persuasion. She went to sleep. In the morning she was up before the household, a habit ingrained by years of boarding house life. She found the kitchen and the stove and had coffee going before Maria arrived to begin the morning, which earned her a look of genuine respect from the older woman that felt more valuable than a formal compliment. Graham Archer appeared with the son, already dressed for a working day, and stopped short when he came into the kitchen and found it occupied and coffee ready. He looked at Eudora with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, that quick, careful assessment followed by something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "You did not need to," he said. "I was awake," she said, and handed him a cup. He took it with the unself-conscious ease of a man who is comfortable in his own kitchen, and she found she liked that about him, the lack of ceremony in it. They ate breakfast together while Maria packed provisions and Graham outlined the morning's plan. They would ride into Harlan Station first. He would send a telegraph to the Dunn Ranch on her behalf. He would collect his supplies, and then he would take her on to the Dunn property by midday. It was a clean, simple plan, and she appreciated the clarity of it. The wagon was a good solid working wagon, well-maintained, drawn by a matched pair of bay horses who moved with the assured confidence of animals that know their work. Eudora's rented horse was tied behind, her trunks loaded in the wagon bed. She climbed to the wagon seat, and Graham Archer climbed up beside her, and they set off down the track with the morning air around them cool and sharp with the smell of dew. The road to Harlan Station was better in the daylight, or perhaps it was simply better with someone who knew it beside her. Graham pointed out the landmarks as they passed them, the naming of things, the water tower visible above the tree line that marked the town from a distance, the family that had built the sod house they passed and since moved on to proper lumber, the place where the road forked and why you kept left. He did not narrate constantly but offered information the way a capable person offers it at the moments when it was useful. "You know this country well," she said, when he had identified a particular cluster of cedar trees as the landmark for the road she had taken yesterday. 11 years, he said. "You learn a place in 11 years. Do you ever think of going back to Virginia?" The question was out before she had decided to ask it. He was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she had overstepped. "There is nothing in Virginia for me anymore," he said at last. "The land I grew up on was sold during the war. My parents are gone. My brother went to Kansas and has his own life there." "Texas is home now," she nodded. There was something in the way he said it that made her not want to press further, not from reluctance to know more but from respect for the weight of the statement. He had made peace with something that most men she knew had never managed to make peace with: the permanence of change. Harlan Station was a working frontier town, exactly what the name suggested. It had the character of a place that was not trying to be anything other than what it needed to be. A main street of packed earth lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a post office and telegraph office, a bank that was newer than everything else, a blacksmith, a saddle maker, a small hotel, 2 saloons, and a church at the far end that someone had recently whitewashed. There were people moving about on errands, cowboys crossing the street, a woman in an apron outside the dry goods store, a man in a dark coat who had the aspect of a lawyer or a preacher, and turned out to be the town doctor. Graham pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, and a boy of about 10 appeared from nowhere to hold the horses in exchange for a small coin. Graham helped her down from the wagon with a hand that was steady and warm and did not linger, which she noted without being able to say why she noted it. He took her to the telegraph office first. The telegraph operator, a thin young man named Perkins who had the alert eyes of someone who spent his days in the middle of everybody's news, took down Eudora's message and sent it off to the Dunn Ranch with the efficient competence of his profession. The message was brief. Delayed one night due to road confusion. Stop arriving by midday today. Stop. All is well. Stop Eudora Maddox. While Graham went to the general store, Eudora walked along the main street with the attentive curiosity of someone new to a place and interested in it. She was stopped by the woman in the apron outside the dry goods store, who introduced herself as Pearl Hennessy, and who clearly operated on the intelligence network that every small frontier town runs, which is to say she knew Eudora was new before Eudora had said a word. "Are you the new woman out at the Archer place?" Pearl Hennessy asked, with the brightness of someone who finds new information professionally satisfying. "No," Eudora said. "I am on my way to the Dunn Ranch. I was misdirected yesterday and Mr. Archer was kind enough to offer lodging for the night." Pearl Hennessy received this information and filed it with evident interest. "Graham Archer is a good man," she said, with a firmness that suggested she had an opinion about him that she had held for some time and was comfortable defending. "Quiet, but good. Keeps to himself more than he should, maybe, since his wife passed." Eudora went very still for exactly the length of time it took to ensure she did not look as though she had gone still. "I was not aware," she said carefully. 4 years ago," Pearl Hennessy said, and there was genuine sympathy in it alongside the information. "Fever. It was quick, which people always say as though quick makes it better, but there you are. Left him with the ranch and a lot of quiet. He has never really come back from it, not all the way, though he manages fine enough." Eudora said the appropriate things. She finished the conversation with the appropriate warmth. She walked a little further down the street and stood very still for a moment outside the blacksmith's, listening to the ring of the hammer inside, and told herself that this piece of information changed nothing because it was not relevant to her situation in any way. She was going to the Dunn Ranch. That was what she was doing. She went back to find Graham Archer. He was loading the last of his supplies into the wagon bed with the systematic efficiency of a man who loads wagons regularly and knows exactly how things fit together. He had a quantity of flour and dried goods, some coils of rope, 2 bags of feed, and a flat package wrapped in brown paper that he set into the wagon with more care than the other items. "What is that?" she asked, because she found she was interested in the things he was careful with. He looked at the package, then at her. "Seeds," he said. "I ordered them from a catalog in February. They are for the garden." "The flowers along the porch rail," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression that she was beginning to understand as his version of being caught off guard. "Yes," he said. "My wife planted roses when we first came here. I have kept them going." He said it plainly, not with grief performed for an audience, but not without gravity either. The statement existed in the middle of those two things, the way real feeling tends to when it has been lived with long enough to find its place. "They are lovely," Eudora said, and meant it without agenda. He nodded. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. They drove out of Harlan Station, heading east on a morning that had warmed to something generous and clear. The road through the low country was as different from the previous day's road as something could be while still being the same kind of road. Graham navigated it with ease, pointing out where the ground softened and why, where you kept to the right to avoid the drainage that ran off the hill to the left in wet weather, where the road widened past the old Garrett property, and why there was a burned-out chimney standing alone in the field beside it. He told her that the Garrett family had moved on 5 years back, which in this part of Texas usually meant either opportunity found elsewhere or something worse, and in the Garrett case it had been something worse, a drought year that had taken the cattle and then a fire that had taken the house. "It is a hard country," Eudora said, looking at the lone chimney as they passed it. "It is," he agreed. "It gives back well when it gives, but it does not forgive much." She looked at the landscape as they moved through it and understood what he meant. There was a beauty in it that was not soft, a grandeur that demanded something from you in exchange for the privilege of looking at it. It was not the rounded, forgiving green of Ohio or the managed prettiness of St. Louis parks. It was wild and specific and proud of itself. "I think I understand why people come here," she said. "Some of them never leave," he said, "even the ones who plan to." She wondered, listening to his voice, which category he placed himself in. The Dunn Ranch came into view at 11:15 by the watch she kept in her carpet bag. It was larger than the Archer property, with more buildings arranged around a central yard, and a larger main house of weathered lumber rather than stone. There was a covered well in the yard, and a clothesline with laundry moving in the breeze, and a general aspect of a property that was busy in the way large family operations tend to be busy. A man came out of the main house as they drove into the yard. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with a sun-reddened face and the look of a man who was accustomed to managing things. He looked at the wagon and then at Eudora and then at Graham Archer with the quick appraisal of a man who ran a large operation and was used to assessing situations rapidly. "Miss Maddox," he said, as she climbed down from the wagon, "I got your telegraph message this morning. No harm done, I trust." "None at all," she said. "I am sorry for the confusion. I followed the directions I had and took the wrong crossing." Hollis Dunn nodded and shook her hand with the brisk practicality of a man who was already thinking about the logistics of having a new housekeeper to show around. He looked at Graham with the neighborly acknowledgement of two men who knew each other well enough to nod. "Good of you to bring her over, Graham," he said. "It was on my way," Graham said, which was not entirely accurate but was the kind of thing men said to each other in this country, when they did not want to make a production out of having done something decent. Graham's men helped unload Eudora's trunks from the wagon. Eudora stood in the Dunn yard with her carpet bag over her arm and watched Graham Archer climb back up onto the wagon seat and gather the reins. He looked down at her from the wagon, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the morning air moved between them carrying the smell of grass and horses and the particular clearness of a Texas spring day. "Thank you," she said, "for the room and the breakfast and the ride." "Arrive safely next time," he said. It was dry, almost teasing, and completely unexpected from a man she had taken to be serious-natured, and it made her laugh, a quick, real laugh that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned the wagon and drove out of the Dunn yard, and Eudora Maddox watched him go and then turned to face Hollis Dunn and the life she had come to Texas to build. The Dunn household was large and demanding in the way of a ranch that had grown faster than its domestic organization could keep pace with. Hollis Dunn was a widower of 6 years with 3 grown sons, one of whom still lived at the ranch with his own young family, a daughter-in-law named Carolyn who was quietly overwhelmed, and 2 small grandchildren who were magnificently energetic. There were also 4 ranch hands who ate at the main house table, a habit established by the first Mrs. Dunn and maintained by inertia. Eudora set about her work with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been managing a large household since the age of 17. She organized the pantry, established a cooking schedule, sorted the laundry arrangements, politely redirected the ranch hands away from the kitchen at hours when it was not mealtime, and formed a working alliance with Carolyn Dunn that was based on mutual respect and the shared understanding that there was too much to do for either of them to waste time on hierarchy. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. The work did not, however, fill all the space in her head. She thought about the Archer Ranch more than was strictly logical. She thought about the stone house with the muslin curtains and the shelf of books. She thought about the yellow and white flowers along the porch rail that a man had kept growing for 4 years because his wife had planted them. She thought about a voice that told you things plainly, without the performance of either charm or modesty. She told herself she was simply adjusting to new surroundings, and that the previous night had been vivid because it was unexpected. She told herself this several times over the course of the first week, and believed it slightly less each time. On the Thursday of her second week at the Dunn Ranch, she went into Harlan Station with Carolyn Dunn to collect a package at the post office and do the household shopping. She was in the general store comparing prices on dried beans when she heard the bell above the door and turned automatically, the way you do in a small store, and found Graham Archer coming through it. He saw her at the same moment. There was that careful assessment again, and then something warmer behind it. "Miss Maddox," he said, coming toward her with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his own territory. "Mr. Archer," she said, "are you well?" "Well enough," he said. "You are settling in at the Dunn place?" "Yes," she said. "It is a large household, but an organized one now." The corner of his mouth moved. "Now," he said. "It had potential," she said, and he did laugh then, a real one, and the sound of it was unexpectedly good. They talked for a few minutes in the manner of two people who have a reason to speak to each other and are discovering that the reason does not need to be strained for content. He told her about a foal born that week that was proving to be difficult. She told him about the pantry reorganization that had produced, among other things, a forgotten crate of tinned peaches from 2 years previous. He told her the road through the low country had flooded slightly in the rains that had come through Tuesday. She told him she had not yet seen rain here and wondered if it was always like that, the way it came so suddenly and then was gone. "Come to the county gathering on Saturday," he said. It came out of the context of what they were discussing in a way that surprised them both slightly, she thought. "Harlan has a monthly gathering in the town square, music and trading and socializing. Most of the county comes. You should see something of the place beyond the Dunn Ranch." She looked at him. "Are you attending?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and offered nothing further in the way of persuasion, which was the most effective form of it. "Then perhaps I will," she said. Carolyn Dunn, who had appeared from the next aisle at some point during this conversation, and had the bright, alert look of someone who has been listening, while pretending to examine fabric samples, was a great deal more enthusiastic about Saturday's gathering than she would have been if Eudora had mentioned it without the context. The county gathering was held in the open square at the center of Harlan Station on a Saturday afternoon that was golden and perfectly tempered, the kind of day that the Texas spring produced occasionally, as though in apology for the extremes it was also capable of. There were long tables of food brought by various families, a fiddle player and a guitarist who set up near the church steps and played with uncomplicated joy, children running in and out of the adult world with the confidence of those who know they will be tolerated, horses tied along the rail at the edge of the square, and a steady current of people exchanging news and goods and opinions in the way of any close community that does not see each other quite often enough. Eudora came with Carolyn and Holly's Dunn's son Thomas, who was a decent and slightly laconic young man who was visibly happier at ranch work than at social events, but had come anyway because his wife wanted to come, and because some things you do for other people without making it complicated. She found Graham Archer at the edge of the square talking to two other men about something that involved gestures toward the road to the west, which she took to be a road and land conversation of the kind that seemed to form the backbone of most outdoor conversations in this county. He saw her arrive. He did not immediately break off his conversation, but she had the impression that he had noted her arrival with an attention that was precise. He came to find her 20 minutes later, while she was at the food tables talking with Pearl Hennessy and a rancher's wife named Bate Caldwell, who had a forthright personality and strong opinions about cornbread that Eudora found genuinely interesting. "Miss Maddox," he said, arriving with the directness that she was coming to understand was just the way he moved through a room. "I wanted to introduce you to some people." He introduced her to the county judge, a measured and intelligent man named Abernathy who was clearly respected and knew it without being impressed by it. He introduced her to the school teacher, a young woman from Kentucky named Ada Price who had been in Harlan County for 2 years and had the look of someone who had fallen in love with the place against her initial expectations. He introduced her to his neighbor from the other direction, a rancher named Cal Webb who had a broad red face and a laugh that could be heard from a considerable distance, and who clapped Graham on the shoulder with a force that would have staggered a less solid man. "Graham never brings anybody to these things," Cal Webb informed Eudora with the confidential pleasure of a man sharing useful gossip. "Usually stands over there by the fence looking at the horizon like he is considering something philosophical." "I stand near the fence," Graham said, "because it is the most comfortable place to stand." "He means it is away from people," Cal Webb told Eudora and winked. Eudora laughed, and Graham gave Cal Webb a look that communicated something between resignation and affection, the look of a man for a friend whose company he genuinely values, even while wishing he would occasionally exercise more restraint. The fiddle player and the guitarist struck up a livelier tune, and couples began moving to the space in front of the church steps that had been cleared for dancing. Carolyn Dunn pulled Thomas onto the dancing area with an enthusiasm that Thomas bore with the good grace of a man who knew when surrender was the right strategy, and they danced with the cheerful ineptitude of two people who enjoy each other too much to worry about technique. "Do you dance?" Eudora asked Graham, not because she was asking him to, but because she was genuinely curious about the shape of him in different contexts. "After a fashion," he said, "which is to say I know the steps and execute them without distinction." "That is more than many people claim honestly," she said. "Would you like to?" he asked, and this time it was direct and deliberate, nothing that could be mistaken for anything other than an invitation. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. They danced 2 dances, and he was right that he was not exceptional at it, and she was right that honest competence was preferable to performed grace. They were well matched in height, she noticed. She came to his shoulder, and he had a hand on her waist that was sure and considerate both at once, not gripping but present. Dancing in the frontier West of 1882 was not the formal ballroom variety that existed in her St. Louis memories. It was faster and warmer, and the music was designed for pleasure rather than propriety. And by the end of the second dance, she was laughing at something he had said about his own footwork, and he was smiling with his whole face, which was different from the edge of a smile she had been cataloging until now, and she thought that whoever got to see that expression regularly was fortunate. She went home to the Dunn ranch that evening in the wagon with Thomas and Carolyn, who managed to convey, without saying anything direct, that they had both noticed and were both pleased. Eudora looked out at the dark landscape going by and acknowledged to herself, quietly and without drama, that she was in some difficulty. She was hired to the Dunn ranch. Her life here was organized around that fact. Graham Archer lived 4 miles away on his own property with his own life that was built around 11 years of this land, and the memory of a wife he had loved enough to keep her roses growing. She was a woman from St. Louis who had been in this county for 2 weeks and had technically arrived at his house by mistake. She went to bed and slept and did not quite resolve any of this. The following weeks produced a rhythm that she had not anticipated. Graham Archer was in Harlan Station on supply runs with a regularity that she told herself was simply the operational need of a working ranch. And on 5 separate occasions in the month following the county gathering she encountered him there. And on each occasion they talked, and the conversations were not about anything of particular consequence, but were somehow among the most engaging conversations she had been part of in recent memory. He told her about the horses he bred, quarter horses mostly, horses bred for the short-distance speed, and the intelligence needed for working cattle. He had a talent for it that was clearly genuine, and that he talked about with a careful precision that told her he thought seriously about what he did. She told him about growing up behind her father's store, about the travelers who came through and the stories they carried, about how she had learned to read people quickly from a young age because it was necessary when you had a house full of strangers every week. He came to the Dunn ranch once to deliver a horse that Holly's Dunn had purchased, and spent an hour in the yard while Holly's looked over the animal. Eudora, who happened to be hanging laundry on the clothesline that ran along the side of the house with a view of the yard, watched him with Holly's and the horse and noted the ease with which he handled the conversation and the animal both, the way he let Holly's look the horse over at his own pace without filling the silence unnecessarily. He looked up once and found her watching. She did not look away. Neither did he. The afternoon held that moment between them for a beat longer than it needed to. And then Holly's Dunn asked a question about the horse's training, and Graham Archer answered it, and the moment released itself and went on. That evening she wrote a letter to her friend Clara Hutchins back in St. Louis. Clara, who had shown her the newspaper advertisement that had started all of this. She filled most of the letter with practical information about Texas and the Dunn household and the landscape and the food, and at the very end, in the closing paragraph, she mentioned that she had met a rancher named Graham Archer under unexpected circumstances, and that she found his company interesting, which was the most significant understatement she had committed to paper in quite some time. Clara's reply arrived 3 weeks later. It was characteristically direct. "If you find a man interesting in a place you traveled 900 miles to reach," Clara wrote, "then I suggest you give the matter the attention it deserves rather than the attention propriety requires." She refolded the letter and put it in her carpet bag, and thought about that for several days. It was Maria who moved things forward, in the end, in the way that practical and perceptive people often do when the people actually involved are going around their own situation with excessive caution. She sent a message to Eudora at the Dunn ranch by way of a ranch hand who was passing, inviting her to come to dinner on her next free afternoon, which was Sundays, when the Dunn household managed the cooking itself. The message was warm and straightforward, and mentioned that the garden was coming in nicely if she would like to see it. Eudora rode to the Archer ranch on a Sunday afternoon in late May, with the logical justification that it would be rude to refuse an invitation from a woman who had been hospitable to her, and the considerably less logical but more honest reason that she wanted to go. The ranch looked different in late May than it had in early April. The roses along the porch rail were blooming, full and red and fragrant in the warm afternoon, and the other flowers she had wondered about had turned out to be black-eyed Susans, which were not yet blooming but had put on considerable green growth. The pasture on the hill behind the barn was a brilliant green from the recent rains, and the horses in it moved against that green backdrop with an elegance that the working nature of the place did not dim. Maria greeted her at the door with the warmth of someone who had issued the invitation because she wanted to, and showed her through the house to the garden at the back, which Eudora had not seen on her first visit. It was a substantial kitchen garden, well organized and clearly tended with care, running along the south-facing wall of the house where it caught the maximum available light. There were rows of beans coming up, tomatoes staked and climbing, squash spreading their wide leaves, and in one corner, a planting of herbs that released their smell into the warm air with the generosity of things that want to be useful. Graham Archer was in the garden when they got there, on his knees beside the tomato plants doing something with string and a small stake, and he looked up when he heard them and stood, brushing the earth from his hands with the unconcerned ease of a man who is not embarrassed to be found doing domestic work. "Miss Maddox," he said, "you came." "I did," she said. Maria was very persuasive. Maria made a sound that communicated both that she had been persuasive and that she considered this entirely reasonable behavior, and then went inside to begin the preparations for supper and left the two of them in the garden, which Eudora strongly suspected was not accidental. They walked through the garden together, which in practical terms was not a long walk, and then, by the kind of logical continuation that happens when two people are comfortable, and the afternoon is warm and there is no immediate reason to stop, they walked further, around the side of the house and out toward the slope behind the barn where the pasture ran up the hill. He showed her the horses with a pride that was quiet but genuine, picking out individual animals and telling her about them with the specificity of someone who knew them well. There was a mare called Petra who was the foundation of his breeding program, a deep sorrel with a kind eye and a quality of presence that was immediately apparent even to Eudora, who was not a horsewoman. There was a young stallion called Dust that he was working with carefully because the animal's intelligence was as significant as his temperament and both required respect. "You love this work," she said, watching him with Dust at the fence rail. He considered the word. "I do," he said. "It took me a while to understand that a man can love his work without it being a statement about anything else. I spent some time thinking that if I loved the ranch it meant I had accepted something, given up something, but that is not how it is. You can choose a place and it can be truly chosen, not settled for." She looked at the hill and the horses and the wide Texas sky above them. "I think I understand that," she said. "You came 900 miles, he said. "Did you choose it or were you running from something?" She turned to look at him because the question was direct in a way she had not expected, not unkind but without flinching. She thought about it honestly. "Both, maybe," she said. "I was running from a life that had become too small, and I was choosing something larger." "It does not seem like those two things need to be separate." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her with that full attention that she had noticed from the first day, the way he looked at things he was genuinely thinking about. "No," he said, "they do not." They stood at the fence for a while longer in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The sun began its late afternoon decline and the shadow of the hill extended itself across the pasture. "Stay for supper," he said, not a question. Not quite a request either, more like a statement of what he wanted and a recognition that the wanting was there. "Yes," she said. That supper was different from the first one, weeks ago, in the way that knowing a person changes the texture of a meal shared with them. Maria had made a beef roast with the kind of slow confidence that comes from cooking in the same kitchen for 9 years, and there were fresh tortillas and the first of the garden's green beans, and a pie of dried apple that was better than its ingredients had any right to produce. The conversation ranged without design from horses to books, and she discovered that the shelf in the main room had been built, one book at a time, over 11 years of careful acquisition from catalogs and the occasional book dealer who passed through Harlan Station. He had Cooper and Dickens and a battered copy of Moby Dick that he admitted he had read 4 times and was still not certain he understood completely, which she thought was exactly the right relationship to have with that particular book. She had read it too. They talked about it for 40 minutes in a conversation that Maria supervised with quiet approval from the kitchen and occasional commentary. When the evening came on properly and the stars began to appear over the ridge of the hill, she knew she needed to go. She had a horse and the road was familiar to her now, but it was still a night road and practicality was practicality. Graham walked her to where her horse was tied and held the bridle while she mounted. He looked up at her from below and in the starlight his face was all shadows and the clean line of his jaw and those eyes that picked up light somehow even in the dark. "Eudora," he said. He used her given name and both of them registered the change of it. He had called her Miss Maddox for 8 weeks. "I would like to see you again, not by accident, by intention." She looked down at him. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. "Come to the gathering next Saturday," she said, "and find me there on purpose." The edge of a smile came, and then the real one came behind it. "I will," he said. She rode the 4 miles back to the Dunn ranch in the dark with the stars enormous overhead, and the mockingbirds calling from the cedar trees along the road, and something so warm in her chest it was almost uncomfortable. The Saturday gathering arrived with the patience of calendar dates that are being anticipated. Graham was there when the Dunn wagon pulled into the square, and he came to find her before she had fully climbed down from the wagon, and she saw Carolyn Dunn take Thomas's arm with a grip that suggested she was containing herself with effort. They spent the afternoon together in the easy way of two people who have decided to be together, without yet saying it formally. He brought her a cup of lemonade that someone was selling from a stand. They looked at the goods being traded at the outer edge of the square. She examined a length of blue calico that she did not need, and he stood beside her watching her examine it with a patience she found touching. They talked to Cal Webb and his wife Nora, who was small and sharp-eyed and clearly the mechanism by which Cal Webb remained functional, and Nora Webb looked at Eudora with the appraising warmth of a woman who was deciding whether someone was good enough and concluding, apparently, that they were. When the music started, Graham held out his hand without preamble, and she took it, and they danced 3 dances this time, and he was not any better at the technical execution, but she had stopped caring about that approximately halfway through the first dance, because he was watching her with an expression that made technique entirely irrelevant. Between the second and third dance, they stood at the edge of the cleared area, and he said, in the low, direct voice that she now thought of as specifically his, "I have been thinking about you consistently since the morning you knocked on my door." She looked at him. The fiddle player was tuning up, and the noise around them was generous enough to give the moment a kind of privacy. "I have been thinking about you too," she said, "since before I left your porch that first night." "That was the first night," he said. There was something in his voice that was careful and warm together, like someone opening a door they have kept closed and finding it opens easily. "I know," she said. "You were on your way somewhere else," he said. "I was at the wrong ranch," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were." The fiddle started up again, and this time when they danced it was different, the small distance between them less careful, his hand on her waist more certain of its right to be there, and she turned her face up to look at him, and he looked back, and the entire noisy, warm Saturday afternoon of Harlan County folded itself around that fact. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Eudora Maddox's life, which she understood as they were happening, a fact she considered unusual since most of the best things in her experience had only become clear as such after they had passed. But this was specific and present, and she was in it with her eyes open. He came to the Dunn Ranch twice more with legitimate business reasons that she suspected he had arranged with Hollis Dunn, who was a man of practical intelligence and considerable discretion. She rode to the Archer Ranch on Sunday afternoons with the regularity that Maria had facilitated and now simply expected. They went together to the monthly gathering and to a church service that she attended out of community solidarity rather than strong personal conviction, and that he attended because she was going, which she found out from Cal Webb before Graham told her himself. He told her about his wife. Her name had been Helen. She had been from Georgia, come west with her family at 15, met Graham when he arrived in Texas, and was building his ranch at 22. She had been practical and funny, and she had loved the land from the first day. The fever had come in September of 1878, and it had been fast, as Pearl Hennessy had said, and he had come as close to losing himself as he had ever been. And the ranch and Maria and the horses had been the things that had given him something to put his hands to when his mind would not rest. He told her all of this one Sunday afternoon in the garden, sitting on the low stone wall that ran along the back of the vegetable beds, with the warm smell of growing things around them and the birds in the live oak trees commenting on the afternoon in their varied ways. He told it steadily and without apology for having loved someone, which she thought was exactly right. "She sounds like someone worth grieving," Eudora said. "She was," he said. "I did not stop. I do not think you entirely stop. But it changes. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." She looked at his hands resting on his knees, capable and still. "You are a good man, Graham Archer," she said. He turned to look at her with a directness that held something unguarded in it. "Eudora," he said, "I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you something." "Tell me now," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. It was simple and complete. "I have been trying to be careful about it, because you came here for a reason that had nothing to do with me, and you built something real at the Dunn place, and I did not want to be the thing that disrupted your life when you had only just arranged it. But I am in love with you, and I think you should know." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been honest with her from the first minute, who had told her she was at the wrong ranch without making her feel foolish about it, who had kept roses growing for 4 years and had a shelf full of books, and who danced without distinction and talked about horses with the precision of real passion, and who had just told her he loved her in the most straightforward terms available to the English language. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for quite some time." He reached across the small space between them on the stone wall and took her hand, and the warmth of his hand around hers was so right that she had the peculiar thought that this was what her hands had been waiting for without her being aware of the waiting. He leaned toward her, and she met him, and there in the garden at the back of Redstone Ranch, with the smell of tomatoes and herbs and old roses drifting over them, and the Texas sky enormous and blue above, Graham Archer kissed Eudora Maddox for the first time, and it was as honest and certain and unhurried as everything else about him. When they separated, she kept her hand in his, and they sat in the garden for a long time while the afternoon moved around them, talking and not talking with equal comfort, and she thought that she would remember this afternoon for the rest of her life. He proposed to her in August, in the most Graham Archer way imaginable, which was to say without theatrical staging or borrowed eloquence. They were standing on the front porch of Redstone Ranch in the early evening after supper, watching the sky do the extravagant color display it managed at sunset in August, and he said, "I would like to marry you, Eudora. I want to build this life with you." She turned from the sky to look at him. He was looking at her rather than the sky, which told her something about his priorities. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he confirmed, as though it were information being verified. "Yes," she said again, laughing. He had a ring that had been his mother's, brought west from Virginia in a small velvet bag that he had kept these 11 years without quite knowing why he was keeping it. He put it on her finger in the kitchen, while Maria wept with the productive enthusiasm of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this outcome for several weeks and was now satisfied. She gave her notice to Holly's Dunn with the respect the situation deserved, explaining the circumstances with the directness he had always appreciated in her. He received the news with good grace and a genuine warmth, shook her hand firmly, and said that she had brought the household into better order than it had been in some years, and that he wished her every happiness, and that Graham Archer was a man who deserved good fortune. She liked him for that. Carolyn Dunn cried and hugged her and extracted a promise of Sunday visits, which Eudora gave sincerely, because she had come to value Carolyn's friendship in the months at the Dunn Ranch, and had no intention of leaving it behind simply because she was changing addresses. The wedding was held in October, at the church in Harlan Station on a morning that had the sharp clarity of a Texas fall, the sky a blue so deep it looked painted, the air carrying enough of a bite to make everyone glad they had worn their good coats. Ada Price, the schoolteacher, played the piano. Cal Webb stood up with Graham because they had known each other for 8 years, and Cal had, according to Maria, spent 6 of those years telling Graham he worked too much. Carolyn Dunn sat in the front row with Thomas and the children and cried pleasantly. Maria wore her best dress, which was dark green with ivory buttons, and sat with Holly's Dunn, who had come because Graham had asked him and because he respected both parties. Eudora wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the 3 weeks before the wedding, working on it in the evenings in the Dunn kitchen after supper. It was not an elaborate dress, but it was beautifully made, fitted correctly and finished properly. And she wore her dark hair up with a few small white wildflowers that Carolyn had pressed into her arrangement that morning, with the decisive confidence of someone who has strong opinions about bridal hair. Graham, when he saw her come through the church door on Holly's Dunn's arm, the older man having offered himself for the purpose with a quiet gruffness that had moved her considerably, went very still and looked at her with an expression that she could feel from 30 feet away, and that she was fairly certain was going to stay with her until she died. They said their vows with the straightforward clarity that both of them brought to everything that mattered. The minister was a solid man of considerable experience, who had married half the county at one point or another, and who could tell the difference between a couple performing commitment and a couple meaning it. He told them afterward, outside the church in the sharp October air, that he considered theirs one of the most genuine ceremonies he had performed, which they both received as the compliment it was intended to be. The celebration afterward was at the Archer Ranch, which from this day forward was also Eudora's ranch, a fact that settled onto her as she came through the front door for the first time as its resident rather than its guest, settling onto her like a garment made to fit. Maria had cooked for days. The long table in the main room held more food than the gathered company could have managed if they had applied themselves seriously to the task, which they attempted anyway. There was music from a fiddle player and the guitarist from the monthly gatherings, both of whom seemed genuinely glad to be there. Cal Webb danced with his wife Nora, and then with Maria, who matched him step for step with the authority of someone who has never been uncertain on a dance floor. The Dunn children ran between the adults' legs with the liberating confidence of children at parties who know no one is going to be too strict tonight. Eudora and Graham danced together in the main room of their own house, with a happiness so uncomplicated that she had to keep reminding herself she was allowed to feel it without bracing for the other shoe. Later in the evening, when the company had thinned and the children were asleep in the spare room, and Maria had retired, and Cal and Nora Webb had ridden home in their wagon with the satisfied air of people who had attended something worthwhile, Eudora and Graham sat on the front porch in the October night with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them and the stars overhead in their full extravagance. "You knocked on my door 7 months ago," he said. "You told me I was at the wrong ranch," she said. "You were," he said. "I was not," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the darkness she could see his smile, the real one, the one she still felt was a small personal privilege every time it appeared. "No," he agreed. "You were not." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they sat together on the porch of Redstone Ranch looking at the Texas sky, and the night was warm enough for October and the stars were doing everything they could, and it was, in every possible sense, exactly where she was supposed to be. The first winter of their marriage was a real one, not harsh by the standards of the Northern Territories, but a genuine Texas winter with cold nights and occasional ice on the water trough and mornings that made the barn work something to be done with speed and fortitude. They learned each other in close quarters, the specific domestic intimacy of 2 people sharing a household, a table, a kitchen, a bed, a morning routine and evening quiet. She loved the mornings. He was always up before her, which was remarkable given that she was not a late sleeper by any measure, and she would come into the kitchen to find the stove going and the coffee on and him at the table reading or occasionally already outside, and the dailiness of it, the ordinary reliable continuity of his presence, was something she had not understood she had been missing until she had it. He was an attentive husband in the way that careful people are attentive, not with grand gestures but with a sustained noticing of things. He noticed when she was tired and adjusted accordingly. He noticed when something had troubled her and asked about it simply, without dramatics, in a way that made it possible to answer honestly. He noticed that she enjoyed reading as much as he did and doubled the frequency of his book orders, and the shelf in the main room began to expand with her additions alongside his, which she thought was a rather precise metaphor for what they were building together. Maria, who remained at the ranch as cook and housekeeper with a job description that now involved considerably more actual collaboration, since Eudora was perfectly capable in the kitchen and had her own opinions, navigated the adjustment with the pragmatic ease of someone who had decided to love Eudora and was therefore not interested in territory disputes. They became, over the winter months, something closer to partners than employer and employee, which suited both of them and which Graham watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose household was running in a manner he found deeply reassuring. Spring came back around with the unargued authority of the seasons in Texas, and with it the second planting of the garden, which Eudora now shared with Graham in the literal sense of doing the work, alongside him rather than simply admiring his results. She had always kept a kitchen garden in theory, but the St. Louis boarding house had not had sufficient land for more than a few pots, and she found the scale of this one deeply satisfying. She also discovered, in March of that spring, that she was expecting their first child. She told Graham on a Sunday evening when they were alone, Maria having gone to visit a cousin in town for the weekend. They were in the kitchen and she had made supper, and they were sitting across from each other at the table with the easy quiet of an evening at home, and she simply said it. "I am going to have a child, our child, in September, I think." The stillness that came over him was different from his usual considered quiet. This was the stillness of a man receiving something so large it required a moment to understand its dimensions. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before on his face, something unguarded and overwhelmed and radiant all at once. He stood up from his chair and came around the table to her and took her face in his hands with a gentleness so particular she felt it in her sternum, and he looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then he said, "Eudora," in a voice that sounded like it was carrying a great deal more than just her name. "Yes," she said, smiling up at him. He pulled her into his arms and held her with a care that managed somehow to be both tender and fierce, the embrace of a man who understands that the thing he is holding is precious beyond calculation. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart against her cheek. "A child," he said, into her hair. "A child," she confirmed. He laughed then, the full, generous laugh that she still considered one of her most prized discoveries about him, and she laughed with him. And in the kitchen of Redstone Ranch on a Sunday evening in March, the two of them held each other and their laughter mixed with the smell of the supper they had let go slightly cold, and the sound of the March wind outside, and all of it was luminous. Maria, when told the next day, produced a reaction of such sustained and vibrant celebration that Eudora suspected she had been waiting for this news since approximately the wedding day, and had possibly been praying about it on a regular basis. Cal and Nora Webb came to dinner the following week, and Nora, who had 4 children of her own, proceeded to provide Eudora with a thorough and sensible education on what to expect over the coming months, for which Eudora was genuinely grateful. Carolyn Dunn, who had already been through it twice, was equally helpful and additionally wonderful in the way of a friend who has been looking forward to sharing this particular experience with you. The pregnancy was not easy in the middle months. There was a period in late April and May when Eudora felt the particular grinding exhaustion and physical unsettlement that some pregnancies produce with magnificent thoroughness, and she was grateful in those weeks for a husband who did not minimize it or pretend it was not happening, who simply recalibrated his understanding of what the household needed and adjusted without commentary, taking on more of the outdoor work to ensure she was not overtaxed. Appearing in the kitchen without being asked to help carry things that were heavy, sitting beside her in the evenings with a book, and his presence when presence was what she needed most. "I am not an invalid," she told him one evening when she caught him looking at her with what she privately called his careful face. "No," he agreed. You are a woman doing something extraordinary and working extremely hard at it while also running this household to a standard that would shame most hotels. I am aware of the difference." She looked at him. "You are an excellent husband," she said. "I am trying to be," he said, with the characteristic honesty that still, after a year of knowing him, could catch her off guard. By June she felt considerably better, and the summer months were, despite the Texas heat, among the happiest she had experienced. The ranch was in good production. The horses were doing well. Graham had sold 4 animals to a buyer from San Antonio, who had come specifically for Petra's offspring, and gone away so satisfied that he had left a standing order for the following year. The garden was in full production, and the roses along the porch were in their second bloom of the season. And in the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the light change over the hill and talked, or did not talk according to what the evening seemed to require. There was an occasion in July when a disagreement arose between them, real and genuine, the kind that had to be navigated rather than smoothed over. It was about the ranch finances, specifically about Graham's habit of managing the books in a manner that Eudora, who had managed a boarding house's accounts for 6 years, found less organized than it needed to be. She said so directly. He was not immediately receptive to this assessment, responding with a brief defensiveness that she understood was natural but was not useful. They argued with the low-grade intensity of 2 stubborn and intelligent people who each believed they were correct, which they each were in their own way, until the argument produced its own resolution, which was that Graham acknowledged her competence in this area, and she acknowledged his in his, and they agreed on a system that incorporated both their approaches. The resolution was not arrived at immediately. It took 2 days and several conversations, and one evening where they were both very quiet and careful with each other in the way of people who have said more than they meant to. On the 3rd day Graham said, "I was defensive when you were right. I apologize." Plainly, without theatrical remorse. And Eudora said, "I could have raised it more gently. I apologize for that." And then they were done with it, and the books were reorganized, and the ranch's financial records were thereafter maintained in a manner that either of them could interpret at a glance. She thought, in a quiet way, that working through something difficult and coming out the other side without damage was one of the better proofs available that a marriage was built on something solid. James Graham Archer arrived on the 5th of September in the year 1883, which meant he entered the world at approximately the 1-year anniversary of his mother's unplanned arrival at the ranch that was now his home. He was a large, healthy, vocally confident infant who announced his presence with the full force of his intentions, and who had, from his first opening of his eyes, his father's gray-green gaze turned on the world with what appeared to be careful assessment. Graham held his son for the first time with the particular combination of terror and certainty that first-time fathers who are serious about things tend to exhibit, and Eudora watched him from the bed where she was recovering, exhausted and more joyful than she had ever been, and saw on Graham Archer's face an expression so open, and so without reservation that it brought tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with fatigue. "James," Graham said, looking at the baby with the directness he brought to everything that mattered. "Welcome." Maria could be heard in the kitchen producing sounds of celebration with the pots and pans, which seemed entirely appropriate. The doctor who had attended, the same dark-coated man she had seen in Harlan Station on her first day, Dr. Hargrove, confirmed that mother and child were both well and healthy, and that James was a fine specimen of the new Texan population, which he said with the dry warmth of a man who had delivered a considerable number of Texans and was not given to false enthusiasm. Nora Webb came the following week with a basket of food and took one look at James and declared that he had the look of a boy who would be tall, which proved, over the following years, to be accurate. Cal Webb arrived separately with Graham's favorite brand of whiskey, and they sat on the porch together in the September evening, while Eudora rested inside, and whatever was said between them out there was between them, but she heard Cal's big laugh carry in through the window twice and Graham's voice underneath it, and she smiled up at the ceiling of their bedroom and felt the wholeness of her life settle around her like something exactly fitted to the shape of her. James grew with the enthusiasm of a boy who has found the world interesting and has considerable energy to apply to the investigation of it. He was walking before most people's children walked, talking before most people's children talked, and developing opinions about horses at an age when most children were still developing opinions about which foods they were willing to accept. He had his father's directness and his mother's precision, and a humor that seemed to belong entirely to himself. The years at Redstone Ranch accumulated with the richness of years that are being lived fully. The horse breeding program that Graham had built continued to grow, his reputation for quality animals extending beyond Harlan County to the broader Texas market, and eventually to buyers who came from as far as Colorado and Kansas. Eudora managed the domestic operation of the ranch with the systematic competence that had always been hers, but now had the additional dimension of being applied to something she owned and loved rather than something she had been hired to maintain. She also, gradually and with the practical intelligence that characterized everything she did, became genuinely knowledgeable about the ranch work itself. Not just the domestic side, but the land management, the horse breeding records, the seasonal patterns of the business. She and Graham worked as partners in the full sense of the word, each with their particular competencies, each respecting the others, each willing to learn from the other what they did not know. She was aware, as they all were, of the larger world moving around their life. The frontier was changing. The great cattle drives that had characterized the earlier years of the Texas cattle industry were giving way to the enclosure of land, the expansion of the railroads making the long drives less necessary. The towns were growing. Harlan Station, which had been a working frontier station when she arrived, was by 1885 a small but genuine town with a school and a doctor and a bank and 2 churches, and a newspaper that had been started by a young man from Baltimore who had come west with ink on his fingers and a significant quantity of ambition. The injustices of the era existed around them and could not be fully separated from the life they were living. The Comanche and other native peoples had been pushed from this land within the lifetime of many people still alive in the county, a fact that sat uneasily in Eudora's awareness the more she came to love the landscape that was in some fundamental sense not only hers to love. She raised this with Graham in one of their long evening conversations, not with simple answers available, but with the honest discomfort of a woman who thought about things and did not like leaving important things unexamined. He listened to her without dismissing it. He had his own relationship to the history of the land, complicated by having chosen it and built his life on it, and loved it with a genuine love while also understanding what had been done to make it available for that choice. "There is no clean way to hold it," he said. "What I can do is be honest about what it is and not pretend the history is something other than what it was, and treat the people I encounter with the respect that belongs to them." It was not a resolution. History does not resolve in a single conversation, but it was an honest and thoughtful holding of an uncomfortable truth, and she thought that was as much as any person could honestly claim to do. Maria remained at the ranch for years, becoming in practice a member of the family rather than an employee, the relationship having evolved past those categories naturally and without formality. She was James's first language teacher in Spanish and his most enthusiastic audience for the mischief he got into in the kitchen, and she and Eudora were by this point in something closer to an equal partnership than any employment arrangement, the authority of long shared life having superseded the original structure. When James was 4, Eudora discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier physically than the first had been, and the October morning when a leaner rose archer arrived, named for the roses along the porch rail, and for Graham's mother whose ring was now on Eudora's left hand, The household of Redstone Ranch received her with the comprehensive joy of a family that had plenty of room in it for more love. Elinor turned out to be a compact and serene infant who observed the world with patience, and as she grew, developed a particular talent for stillness that was completely her own and quite unlike either parent, a gift for sitting quietly with animals and people that made both trust her quickly. She had her mother's dark hair and a face that was her own in the way that some children's faces are uniquely themselves from the beginning. James took his role as elder brother with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally excessive, subjecting Elinor to a program of education about the horses that she endured with good grace from a very young age, and that the horses themselves seemed perfectly content to participate in. The third child, born in 1888, was a boy they called Henry, and he came into the world already determined about things, with a set to his jaw that made the doctor laugh, and that fulfilled exactly what that jaw set implied, because Henry Archer grew up to be the most determinedly himself person that anyone at Redstone Ranch had ever encountered, full of opinions and forward motion, and a completely unshakable confidence that the universe was navigable if you simply paid attention to it. 3 children made the stone house loud and full and wonderful in the way that households with children in them are, which is to say not always comfortable, sometimes exasperating, and fundamentally alive in a manner that the house had not been before, and that both Graham and Eudora valued without reservation. Graham, watching his children grow up on the land he had built and in the house he had made, with the woman he loved beside him in the work of it and in the evening of it, carried a quiet happiness that was the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. It was the happiness of a man who knows exactly where he is and has chosen to be there, and finds the choice confirmed daily. Eudora, for her part, had stopped thinking of herself as someone who had arrived at the wrong ranch a long time ago. She had arrived at the right place by the most useful route available, which was an unexpected one. She had come 900 miles looking for a clean start, and had found instead something better than a start. She had found a life that fit her, not because it had been waiting perfectly assembled, but because she and Graham had built it together, argument and conversation and shared work and laughter and all. On a September afternoon in 1890, which was the 7th anniversary of James's birth and therefore, by the arithmetic she carried privately, also the 8th anniversary of her arrival at Redstone Ranch, Eudora stood on the front porch in the late afternoon light watching her 3 children in the yard below. James, 7, was teaching Elinor, who was 5, to throw a rope with the methodical patience of a boy who had learned from his father how to show someone something without taking over. Henry, too, sat in the dirt near the water trough with the sublime contentment of a small child who has found a stick and considers it sufficient. She heard Graham's boots on the porch boards behind her and felt his presence beside her before he put his arm around her shoulders and looked out with her at the yard and the children and the hill behind the barn where the horses were moving in the late afternoon gold. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it simply, the way he asked everything, as a question that deserved a real answer. She turned to look at him, this man whose door she had knocked on by mistake 8 years ago, whose name she had not known, who had looked at her on his threshold with that first careful assessment and told her she was at the wrong ranch without making her feel foolish for it. "I am," she said. "Entirely and completely and without reservation I am." He looked at her with the full attention that had been hers from that first afternoon, sage-green eyes steady and warm, and she felt the certainty of him the way she felt the ground beneath her feet, solid and present and specifically itself. "Good," he said. He said it quietly with everything in it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched their children in the yard as the sun completed its afternoon work and began the long gold descent toward the hill, and the roses along the porch rail, red and enduring, moved in the evening breeze that had come in from the north carrying the first cool suggestion of a Texas autumn, And the story of the wrong ranch and the right man and the life that had grown from both of those things settled comfortably into itself, closed and whole and very much alive.